All right, so this little unit is on cell communication, which is really important in obviously keeping organisms alive. When we talk about cell communication, we can mean two things. We can mean the communication in a multicellular organism in between the cells of that organism. For example, in order for you just to stay alive, for example, your cells need oxygen. So cells communicate their need for oxygen. You send all kinds of signals through your body that coordinate with parts of your brain, with your respiratory system, with your muscular system, because your diaphragm that causes breathing is a muscle, with your circulatory system, because your heart is pumping the oxygen to your cells. You have all kinds of communication to make breathing happen and happen at the correct rates. We also see cell communication between organisms. For example, just single-celled organisms, protists in a pond can send information to other protists telling them there's a predator nearby or telling them there's a food source nearby. So cell communication can be in between cells of a multi-celled organism or between two separate organisms altogether. So that's the purpose of this unit. All right. When it comes to cell communication, the simplest, easiest way for two cells to communicate would be if they're actually touching each other. That's called direct communication. We already talked about that type of communication because we learned in the cell chapter about gap junctions and plasmodesmata, which were basically very much like gap junctions in plants. So it's really easy if two cells are literally touching each other for them to communicate because they can technically share their cytoplasm. However, a lot of times cells need to send messages to other cells and the cells are not right there touching them. So there are three types of cell communication, and we're only going to talk, bless you, about the first two today, that involve cells sending messages over some kind of a distance. So the first one is what's called paracrine signaling. It is localized. It's basically one cell sending a signal out just to the cells in the nearby vicinity. And every cell in that vicinity would then receive and respond to that particular signal. The biggest example of this would be growth factor signals, telling cells to divide or not divide. For example, your skin cells are dividing normally at a certain rate. If you get injured, your cells would send a signal that there's an injury and they need to divide faster to as quickly as possible seal the wound to prevent infection. So you would get a scar and it wouldn't take you nearly as long as if the cells just continue to reproduce at the normal slow rate that your skin cells are reproducing. Another thing with growth factors and this type of signaling is cancer. Cancer is related to problems in this kind of signaling. What can happen is you can have a cell that it becomes kind of a rogue cell. Even though cells nearby are sending its signals not to divide, it basically either lacks the receptors or lacks the internal response to receive that signal and respond to it, and it just keeps dividing out of control. And if a cell just keeps dividing out of control, what you basically end up with is a tumor. And that's really all cancer is cells that are dividing out of control. And depending on where they're located, that's what gives you a specific type of cancer. That's why radiation and chemotherapy are used to treat cancer. Because radiation chemotherapy basically kill any cell that's dividing, which is why there's side effects. So you receive radiation and you end up with other cells dying besides the cancer cells. But since cancer cells are doing nothing but dividing, it's going to be effective at killing those cells in particular. Question? There's nothing they can do to fix the cells. The only thing they can do, and this is where gene therapy is coming in, is that they've actually had some success, and that's what they're working on creating viruses that actually have like a DNA to hunt down and find only cancer cells. So it doesn't just kill any dividing cell. It can distinguish between a cell that's supposed to be dividing and a cancer cell, which is why I think that they definitely in the next 20 years will cure cancer. Because they've actually successfully cured some people of specific kinds of cancer using that exact technique with a gene therapy technique. So I definitely think that's something they can do. But that is the issue with cancer, is that it's cells that are not properly responding to this kind of signaling. You may be missing a thing on the outline. It comes from this picture. You should have this picture as well. So again, in summary, one cell in paracrine signaling sends a signal and all the cells around it respond. So this would be very useful for things like growth. If you want an area to grow, send a signal to just everything in that area, and all those cells grow. So at the tips of your bones, bones get longer as you're growing. When you're injured, a scar will form and heal an injury. So that's paracrine signaling. The second kind of signaling is called synaptic signaling, and synaptic signaling is specific to the nervous system, which means only animals use this type of signal because we are the only organisms that have a nervous system. Plants don't have a nervous system, funguses don't, bacteria don't, single-celled organisms definitely don't. Only animals, basically from everything from jellyfish as the simplest level up through all the invertebrates and vertebrates, they all have a nervous system, so they can all use this particular kind of signaling. So synaptic signaling involves basically a nerve cell, a neuron, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. This is where we're going to kind of digress into the nervous system, because I told you it's sort of a hodgepodge. So a neuron looks kind of like this. If you took anatomy, you know more about this. When a signal gets to the end of the neuron, there's a gap between the end of the nerve cell and whatever it's supposed to be stimulating, be that the central nervous system, a muscle, whatever it may be. And this is where synaptic signaling happens. So the neuron releases what are called neurotransmitters, and they go to the next cell. A lot of neurotoxins, or if anybody's ever known someone who's done Botox, basically that's what Botox works on. Botox basically prevents these neurotransmitters. So you're paralyzed. You can't. That's why it gets rid of the lines. You basically, if they screw up, you won't be able to smile either, because you have no muscles control, because these are basically temporarily paralyzed because it's blocked the neurotransmitters, so they can't send the signals anymore. Yeah, it just kind of creeps me out. That sounds scary. That's what happens with botulism, the food poisoning. That basically where they get that toxin from is a bacteria that causes a food poisoning that basically kills you by paralyzing all your muscles and you die. It's a very bad food poisoning. Huh? It's a bacteria called botulinum I forget the Clostridium botulinum, but whatever. Bottom line is it makes botulism toxin, and then I guess cosmetic people figured out, hey, if we dilute this, because somebody screwed up. There was, how these people in Hialeah they're doing in the back of their truck, they're doing Botox. So yeah, there was a guy who was doing I'm probably not gonna be here tomorrow. There was a guy who was doing Botox, and he screwed up. He didn't dilute it enough, and these people were paralyzed. They were on a ventilator. They still have problems, and somebody maybe even died. So same people that use fix a flat to use blood injections and stuff. It's kind of creepy. So all right, here's a picture of synaptic signaling. So nervous system, and a signal gets to the end of a neuron. It sends out a chemical that stimulates the next neuron. So that's what it looks like. So we're going to take a step back and talk very briefly about the nervous system. So neurons are the base unit of your nervous system that are going to carry your impulses. And this is very, very general. If you take anatomy, you would spend 2 weeks talking about the nervous system. We're doing a little 10-minute thing. But in the simplest terms, what's going to happen in the nervous system, and I know you have this picture probably in your notes as well, a stimulus happens. In this case, the person got their hand pricked by a tack. A sensory neuron picks up that information and goes all the way, one long skinny nerve cell, from their hand all the way to the spinal cord, which is what this is supposed to represent. So that's called a sensory neuron. CNS, do you know what that stands for? Yes, the central nervous system, which is basically your brain or your spinal cord. That's going to do the processing. In the case of a pain receptor, like touching a tap or a hot stove or something like that, it doesn't even have to get to your brain. It goes to the spinal cord, and immediately then a motor neuron comes back from the spinal cord to the muscle, and you pull your hand away. And that may happen before you even realize, ouch, that hurts. You've already pulled your hand away. And that's called a reflex arc. It's the same thing they're testing when you go to the doctor and they knock your knee with that little device. I'm sure it has a name. I don't know the name of it. and it's a knee-jerk reflex. They're basically testing that's a simple way of testing your nervous system. If you have nerve damage, they would hit your knee, and either there would be a gap in the response time, or you might not move your knee at all. And vets actually do this too. I took my dog to the vet. She had hurt her back, and they actually had her on a table, and they didn't use the little knee-jerk thing, but they basically they flipped her foot under and looked to see how long it took her to straighten it out. And on one of her feet, like her back right one, there was a gap in time, so they could tell that there was something wrong. There was some kind of a problem, which they were able to just treat with like some steroids and stuff like that. But she just straightened it. But it's interesting that even in all organisms, they can test simple reflexes like that. So that's what called a reflex arc, and that's sort of the simplest pathway for your nervous system. Here's what a neuron looks like. You have this picture in your outline as well. You've got dendrites. This is the side where the signals come in on these little dendrites. If there's enough stimulus, it causes a signal to travel down the neuron to, like I said, your brain or your spinal cord. There has to be a big enough stimulus. It's sort of an all or nothing thing. If a couple of these get stimulated, it might cause, sort of like dropping a tiny little pebble in the water, it might cause a little ripple, but it's not enough to actually cause a reaction. Whereas if something really big happens, you get a tsunami, it goes all the way across the ocean. So you need enough stimulus to actually start this sort of chain reaction, and this wave will sort of go the whole way. Again, we're not going to go into a lot of details about this. This is just some basic definitions. So the dendrites pick up the signal. This is the cell body where the nucleus and everything is. If a signal is strong enough, it causes this chain reaction, which would travel down the axon. And you'll notice that the axon is covered with these little ball-like things. And this is called myelin. Again, we're not going to talk about it in detail in here, but if you take anatomy, you'd learn a lot more about this. Myelin speeds up how fast a signal can travel. Rather than the signal having to travel this whole distance, it can actually very quickly jump to these little gaps. They're called nodes. And the signal actually can jump from node to node and travel faster than if the myelin wasn't there. I will also tell you that some diseases, like Parkinson's and some degenerative neurological diseases, are actually associated with exactly this problem, that the myelin breaks down. Then the signals don't transmit properly, and so you end up with things like tremors, and the muscles don't react. I think myasthenia gravis may be related to this, and maybe Lou Gehrig's disease. There's a couple of different ones, but they have to do with the myelin breaking down, and so there's the impulses don't travel properly. And then the synapse is this gap at the end that I mentioned before. Okay, so that's going to bring us to the last section. Let me pause